I'd like to talk to you about access control for openEHR data. And in my experience, I'm coming from a clinical background, and I used to hate the systems that I worked with in the hospital. So I was trying to make them better. And I realized that it's actually a systematic problem why these systems are so bad. It's not that people are not trying, but there are fundamental reasons. One is the data models are really bad. And this is what we hear a lot about on openEHR, how to get better data models, how to get interoperable systems. But it's also about communicating with other organizations. What Ian just showed us is that a lot of information is already present, but a lot of openEHR's focus is on data that is in one system. We heard a little bit about federation in EY's talk, but it was about research. And if you want to work together with other organizations, you have to fix access control and a few other highly related problems. So what's exciting to me is that for me these worlds, they come together. The openEHR data modeling is very nice and a lot of cool stuff is happening there. But also on the networking in the sense of access control security is exciting. It's a lot of legal things involved. And for me it's exciting that it comes together. That's to explain the title. So my name is Joost. I'm a freelance informatics doctor, and the work I'm sharing with you has been sponsored by RSO Zuid-Limburg. And as a volunteer, I'm active in the openEHR community. Okay, so this RSO where I work for is a regional collaboration in the south of the Netherlands where 11 care organizations work together. There are organizations that are active in 5 domains like primary care, hospitals, etc. There's about 500,000 patients in the region. And the thing is that increasingly, same as everywhere in the world I guess, is that these patients receive care from multiple organizations at the same time. For example, the home care nurse monitors a patient after hospital discharge. And of course, to do this properly, you need shared records. So the doctor needs to be able to see what the home care nurse wrote in their own CDR. And in order to fix this, you need access control on that information. And one of the principles in what we're trying to do in the region is that we want to, the systems to be data-centric, using openEHR and FHIR. And we want to set it up in a distributed federation. We don't want a central database in the region. And we use trust over IP for that. It's an international standard with a Dutch nationalization that's called NUTS, for those of you that are interested. And some other ground rules is, it's really called NUTS. It's half a joke. And the existing EHRs will remain unchanged, so it's not an option to swap out the EHRs to make them compliant with the system. And implementation projects will be use case based, for example, advanced care planning doing it for the region. That's important to keep in mind for the rest of my presentation. So the central question that I'm trying to answer in this presentation is how to do access control for openEHR data in a distributed network. For example, in the region, if you agree that all doctors should be able to write compositions for the advanced care plan, how do you express that? How do you make that work in a region of distributed systems? So the key requirements for this technology is that it has to guarantee compliance with local law, which in Netherlands is quite specific. So you have to have you have to show that if you share the data with another party, for example, a doctor from another organization, you have to show the relevance to the doctor's work to why you have the data. So you can't just say, well, this patient, this doctor has a relationship, he can see the whole EHR. It's very specific. Well, for technical reasons, you want it to be consistent, so all the systems have the same conclusion, whether the specific doctor can see the information or yes or no. We wanted to make it scalable across use cases and outside of the region. This is a key one. We wanted to make it human editable by domain experts. So if you have a technical representation of that access policy I just showed you, so doctors can see the ACP, it should be human editable by people who know the local law. And then it should also be interpretable by a computer, and it has to be like that for existing systems. So you cannot swap out all the systems, but still you want technical expression of the policy that's interpretable by computers. And ideally it will be computer executable, because that makes it much, much faster if you update on new policies. But of course that only works for new systems or systems that explicitly support it. So a little bit of background, this is where it gets a bit more technical, is that this is the standard architecture for access control systems. People might be familiar with XML. This is very similar. So there's a user that wants to view a record, then the data, the request goes through the policy enforcement point that asks the question, does this user with these attributes have access to this data? That's been decided by the policy decision point that interprets the policies that are there available, like the configuration of the system for the access control. And those policies, they are managed by the policy administration point, and sometimes you get extra information, like is this user really a doctor? Could be an information that you ask for the policy information point. Okay. Now if you make that a little bit more specific to the openEHR situation, this would be a user, for example, the home care nurse we talked about before. They use a client application that's managed by the home care nursing organization, and they want to read information from, for example, the hospital CDR. So the client application can send a request to the openEHR CDR using usual APIs like AQL or the composition REST API, and then the CDR includes the policy enforcement point, and they try to get the policies, and the interesting thing is that the policies will be managed by the region. So in the region you try to agree on what the policy is, what it's described like technically, and we haven't come up with exactly how to do this, but you need some way that the openEHR CDR and the policy enforcement point knows which policies from the region to trust. You could put them all in a database and say, well, everything in this database you can trust it, or you could sign it cryptographically, like my organization approved this policy. We haven't decided on that one. And this is actually the policy information point is where the trust over IP, the nut stuff comes in, because this user is a home care nurse, but this hospital doesn't know that user, so it doesn't know that it's actually a nurse. So this is the stuff that trust over IP can fix for you using cryptography. It's some third party attested to this user being a nurse, and that can be checked. So that's quite nice. So I want to spend most of the rest of the time on the policy itself. The exciting thing we found out that there's a language to describe this kind of policies. It's called Rego, and it's the policy language that's defined by the open source project, the Open Policy Agent, which is actually an open source attribute-based access control engine. So it can actually execute the policies you define in there. And these policies in Rego are editable by developers. It's too technical to be editable by domain experts. Of course they could learn, but it's not reasonable expectation. But the great thing is that it can reason, this Rego can reason over JSON input data and information in JSON format. And now it comes. So what we see here on the left-hand side is the Rego policy. So it says the default for this policy is not to allow any user to access this data. Only if these conditions are true, you can access the data. So what kind of data is it? It's about the ACP data. It says here composition.acp, which would be the name of the template used to create the composition. And that is true for doctors that can write. And this is defined here. Dus for the write operation, the user role that is allowed is doctor. So what you see here is that actually the policy in Rego on the left is very generic, and the specific like information decided for this user is defined on the right. And so what you can do is keep this Rego definition. That's quite hard to understand, so you need specialized developers to make this. You can make it generic over a lot of use cases in the region or nationally or even internationally, but there's a few specific links to information in the JSON structure, like the type of information, the type of operations, like the read, write, probably basically CRUD plus search, the ID for the template you want to give access to, and which user should be able to access this. So only this JSON part, you would have to change it for every new use case. And then that's easier. Most users still don't like editing, domain experts don't like editing JSON data by hand, but there's one final step. Yeah, this is what I just showed you. Is that in order to guarantee that the Rego policy, which stays the same over every use case, works with the new configuration in the JSON data, we defined a JSON schema that guarantees that the config file that defines the actual policy is consistent with the generic Rego policy. And then finally, this JSON schema makes it very easy to generate an editor for this kind of policy. So this is a super simple and somewhat still ugly rendering of the JSON schema, but it's super simple to make this a bit nicer, and then you quickly have an editor to edit specific policies. And I hope you can see that this gets to the point where you can give it to a domain expert, similar to an archetype designer. It's not a tool you give to anybody, but people who are working in this field and get a little bit of training, they would be able to edit access policies using a form like this. And what I'm hoping for, because I told you before, is that the policy should be interpretable by existing systems, is that the existing access control servers can be made to work with this JSON schema. So they will not work with the Rego language, that's very complicated to build into your system, but you can build into your system hardcode the rules that are defined in the Rego, and then only make sure you work with specific config files for specific policies. And I have a question mark, because I think it should be doable, but we should try it with people with existing implementations of an ABAC server. I talked to a few, they seem optimistic, but this is what I would really like from the community, to see if this would work for them. Yeah, one more thing to note is that the scope of the resource, like in the policy, there's two sides. There's like, who is this user, which attributes does he have that might give him access to something, and then there's the thing they actually get access to. And in the example I shared it based on the template ID, so any composition of the type ACP, but it could be other resources as well, like a specific composition, like the blood pressure recorded on 17th of November last year. And these are defined by the SMART on openEHR specification. So it's nice that we could reuse that, and that in turn, maybe you know, is based on the SMART on Fire work. So I like that it keeps a bit consistent across the specifications. Yeah, so finally the next step. I would like this policy information check using Trust over IP. We didn't build that yet, but that would be nice that you can actually verify by a third system that this user is a doctor. That technology is there, it's just not been integrated with what we came up with here. Then I would really like to do a proof of concept. So we tested the policies on the openly available Open Policy Agent server. So the policies do execute. If you put the right input data, it does work. They would like to integrate it with probably Airbase. And probably we talked a little bit about this this week, but probably as a proxy before Airbase, but it could be a component in the source code as well. You still have to try. Yeah, this is what I talked about, the feasibility check with existing systems, like does this really work? And then I would really like to standardize this JSON schema. What I showed you just before is just what we came up with in a few hours, but probably it needs to be more extensive and discuss a bit about the wording. So I would really hope that could be standardized. And then there's a bit about the openEHR specifications itself, but because it has specified some rules how to handle access control with openEHR information. For example, that the entry, which is usually like the observation or the evaluation, is the smallest unit you should return in a query. And that's not really correctly formulated, but at least I take it that you should not have access controls that allow you to see only part of an entry. For example, the blood pressure archetype, it has a systolic and a diastolic and a device. It doesn't make any sense that you would be allowed to see the systolic pressure, but not the device it's being recorded with. Then that's really hard then to make clinical reasoning. So these kind of decisions in the openEHR specification would need to be a little bit clearer. And another one is that the composition is the unit of commit. So what's the implication for access control there if you have authorization for one entry in the composition but not another? This kind of stuff we have to think a little bit harder. Okay. I think the presentation is forcing me to be done. I think I had one more slide with, are there any questions? Let me check. Then we can do without. Okay. Yeah. One second.
I think that HDMI cable might have been approaching the end of its life.
Yeah, I think so
It doesn't
too.
work with the laptop. And should I put that back in?
No, please. Okay, yeah, that was it. Are there any questions?
Yes, yeah. So we actually get this kind of request of getting like or hide specific kind of entries specifically for specific like roles. It's like okay, only especially like sexual and this kind of related things. So when you see that it's you need the composition, do you need the, for example, it shouldn't be possible to get, for example, composition plus a path to hide, or is not in the scope of the?
Yeah, you mean so you do get. I was saying that the access control should only be at the level of the entry.
Yeah.
And you're saying sometimes you get a request to blind specific information. Yeah. I've been thinking about this, and I think these are separate issues. Access control is, in my mind, usually quite generic. A doctor can see any ACP composition, while the blinding is usually specific. In the sense there are specific information in this composition that shouldn't be known to other users. And the thing is that the access control policy is usually designed in a generic way, and it's not checked by the user that enters the information. So what I'm thinking, if you want to do blinding like that, so you want to explicitly hide information that's only a tiny part of the composition, it should be user approved. So one user should say, okay, I want to hide this information, and then you assume the responsibility if then mistakes are made because this information is hidden, that's on you. Because it's a valid reason. You said sexual diseases, something like that.
Like something like this.
Yeah, but it needs to be a clinical determination. You cannot do it in general. And of course you can facilitate generic rules that it's blinded by standard and you only have to confirm in the user interface. You can optimize a little bit, that's not that. But
I also know that you can even get two templates, and one is the one general access and the other is the specific access, for example, and that with the access control tool.
Right. Siddharth?
I think you said that the JSON schema should be standardized and that should be used. So how do you envision this happening? So will clinical data repositories like, let's say, Better or Airbase start accepting this as another definition, like an access control definition?
Yeah. That would be what I like. So I would like openEHR probably to standardize the JSON schema, and then start the individual CDR vendors that do access control, probably all of them, and then to accept policies that conform to this JSON schema, and then be able to reason over the information in there. Is that what you're asking?
So, I mean, there's been some work done by Health Samurai and Medplum in this access control space, and then they started off with something similar, where they have a specific access control resource that they can use to like limit what APIs someone can access. Then they all started eventually moving towards this API-based access control. So basically, you said how you can do it at the level of a proxy. So a reverse proxy can like make an API call to an access control endpoint and check if this is actually allowed. And that way, if we standardize that API call that a CDR should make to another endpoint, won't that make more? Won't that allow for more control? So Airbase will we just standardize the API on which what Airbase should ask an endpoint.
You mean standardize the entire API instead of standardizing just the payload with JSON schema?
Yes.
Okay.
Standardize the API that Airbase is going to call an external authorization endpoint and the response.
Could be interesting, but then still you need to standardize the payload, right?
But the payload here is slightly different because you're going to have the context, you're going to have exactly what is being accessed, and you just return like a yes or no, or maybe redact a certain field.
Okay, you mean standardize the API that asks the question, is this allowed, yes or no? Yeah, sure, but the current thinking is that you want to be able to have custom ABAC servers. So Vita Group and Better and NIDAP and whoever already has an existing ABAC server. And so you cannot replace that. Yeah, you can, but would it be feasible?
Slowly it will make sense to build an adapter on these things, and once if we do standardize that and have a, access control API that is part of the openEHR spec. That makes sense.
Yeah, in a way, okay. Yes. I was trying to make the same point that the input data is what the client app sends to the CDR and to the policy enforcement point, and that says I have this user with this ID and I want access to this information, and also this you want to standardize. But then again, that's the payload. It's not the whole API. It's not the URL. It's not the security on it. Yeah. Okay, thanks everybody.